that's their problem. I'm Harry Lewis. This is a departure. Let me just sort of give some background on what these events usually are and why this is a departure. This is a group that I'm one of the founders of called the Institute for the Study of the Work of Wilhelm Reich, who I'll give you an introduction to momentarily if you don't already know. It's also a group that works with people in training and studying out in Seattle and Portland, Oregon. And we're affiliated with a group called the Institute for Orgonomic Science that comes out of Philadelphia. So it's a fairly organized group. In New York, we run regular day-long events. Don't worry, it's not a day. This is only from 10 to 1. But usually we run day-long events in the fall and the spring. Dr. Philip Bennett, who is a scholar and supporter of Reich's work and one of probably the foremost scholar of Reich's work these days, is usually the MC of these events, or the sort of moderator, and usually keeps me in line in terms of how long I go on. Usually the events are around specific topics related to Reich's work historically and scientifically and clinically. What happened is that Greg Tebb, who has worked with me for a number of years, and I have had an ongoing dialogue, as I've had with a number of patients and colleagues who, including my wife, who's not here this morning, but who's a yoga, practitioner, midwife, and about yoga in relationship to orgonomic practice, or orgonomic practice, if you're not familiar, is the practice of the work of Wilhelm Reich, clinically and scientifically. And for many people, it used to be that Reich brought up all sorts of reactions, negative and positive. Now, more than likely, people don't know who Reich is. It's becoming increasingly less well known. So what Greg and I have been talking about over a period of time is Reich or Orgonomy's view on yoga or yoga practice, and the areas that seem to relate to each other versus the areas where there are conflict or issue. And so what emerged out of that, and what emerged out of Greg's work in dealing with Reich and his wife, Kathy, who's also dealt with it, about how you integrate, and one of my other students and patients is Hildy Cronin, who's a teacher of yoga up in the mountains of New York and New England, up in Berkshires. So a lot of what has come out of this is that a number of people who have been involved in yoga have integrated elements of Reich's practice or orgonomic practice into yoga practice, or moderated yoga practice in relationship to it. So it seemed to me appropriate that for those of you who didn't know, part of also the interest in doing this was trying to get some people who ordinarily don't come to events about Reich to have a chance to have some idea of what Reich is and what he isn't. He isn't most of the things, if you know Reich of Reich at all, he isn't almost any of the things you've been told or think you know about him. So my purpose is to begin by giving you just a quick, I promise it will be quick, overview of Reich's life and work and the general place he holds in the origins of what we would today roughly call the holistic approach to health and the sort of relationship between body, mind, and behavior. Reich did not usually concern himself directly with the connection between body, mind, behavior, and soul. His writings on religion were not spiritual. They were scientific, social scientific studies. Okay, anyone interested in them, there's a wonderful book called The Murder of Christ, which is probably one of the best critiques and analysis of religious experience, and particularly the Judeo-Christian experience. That said, let me give you some background on Reich. Reich was born, these I always make references to, in 1897, to be, if you're interested, March 24th, 1897. He was born in the mountains of Austria-Hungary, in what was called Rus Poland. It was a part of Austria that kept going back and forth between Russia and the Austrian Empire. He grew up on a farm, was an officer in the First World War, obviously on the other side, and that experience changed him probably, profoundly. Went to all of his family property and everything was completely lost. He went to Vienna to become a lawyer, as many of you might know if you know Freud's work. Freud also, many of these guys also always started out in the law faculty. It's interesting, and then quickly decided that medicine and science was more interesting. So he moved into medicine and science at the University of Vienna, and as he himself says in his own writing, his own autobiographical writings, the most interesting work going on at that time was outside of the university, and it was the work around Freud. Became a close, student of Freud's, probably, and the rough date, probably in the late 1919 or so, and then slowly became part of Freud's, training group and circle, and was spotted very quickly by Freud and other prominent figures as a wunderkind. He was, just one of these people who, if you gave him, a task, either scientific or educational, he just put it together very, very rapidly, and almost as often demonstrated. When he decided that he needed to know more about Marxism, he sat down and just became fluent in all of Marx's works and literature, and became a militant leader in the left faction of the psychoanalytic movement, and part of the growing leftist intellectual atmosphere in Vienna and throughout the Austro-Hungarian and German empires or societies. He became one of the top figures in Freud's group of younger followers, and actually established at Freud, by asking Freud for permission, established the first training. People are often, I think Greg told me a number of you were therapists or involved with therapy practice. At the time that Reich approached Freud about setting up a training seminar, there was none. I like to tell students just anecdotally that the way you trained as a young psychoanalyst was that either Freud or one of the older analysts who were around said, "Oh, you seem like a very interesting young person. Be home, be at this address tomorrow, and someone will come and they'll be your first patient." And then you would say, "Well, what do I do?" And they said, "Just listen, and when you run into a problem, come to me." So that was literally the extent of training, and you can see that it created interesting possibilities. Reich founded the first clinical seminar in modern psychotherapy, and it ran for a number of years and really established a basic level of training and responsibility, and resulted in the production for him, particularly and for psychoanalysis, of the first book on technique or on basic, fundamental practice of psychoanalysis. So for anyone involved in psychoanalysis, they would know that he was the writer of a classic work called Character Analysis. Okay? And we could go to Dr. Bennett for exact dating. There are arguments about exactly when the book came out, but sometime roughly in around 1920, 28, 29 starts. By 1933, 34, it's in place. But we have arguments about the dating. The aspects of it were being written and prepared from the seminar in the late 20s, early 30s. It is still to this day, as a number of my psychoanalytic associates comment, one of the central texts in training as a psychoanalyst. Okay? However, Reich became very, very clearly involved and interested not only in social activism, but he began to become more active with his patients in the sense that he began to notice that no matter how much insight and intellectual understanding patients gained about their problems, they often didn't make much progress or had relapses in their problems. He began to really look at the patient as a whole organism. And this is a speeded up version. It's a lot more complicated. We have whole seminars just on this level of insight. But by around 1933, 34, again, depending on the date, Reich began to comment very clearly on the fact that patients, and to notice, and he did a very interesting thing, if you know anything about psychoanalysis, Reich moved from behind the patient's couch to sitting alongside the patient and really making direct eye contact with them and really examining their bodies very, very actively. And what he began to notice was that patients could talk endlessly about everything, right, and free associate and do all those things, do all the right things, even bring in all the right dreams, that they were supposed to have, the dream that they needed about their mother, or the dream they needed about this or that, and nothing would happen. And he began to notice that they had characteristic ways of behaving. Sometimes they were very haughty, sometimes they were very, apologetic, sometimes they were very, self-deprecating, sometimes they were very aggressive, but a variety, sometimes they were very happy and playful and flirtatious. And he began to, through various levels of experimentation, poke at that and what's behind that. And gradually began to notice that if you poked at it enough, things began to pop out and come about, and emotions began to move very rapidly in ways that all the talking in the world didn't seem to bring about, or usually didn't bring about. Okay? Then he began to notice that they also have very, very specific ways, along with those kinds of behaviors, right, and presentation of self, right, of holding their body. He noticed that it corresponded to very specific ways that they specifically postured themselves, held themselves, and then he began to also notice that often when they were most actively defending themselves, both physically and behaviorally, they also held their breath. And he began to focus in on that and began to experiment and work with trying to break through that or establish what that related to. And as he did, again, all hell broke loose, and he began to get results with patients very, very rapidly, much more rapidly than any of the more traditional approaches in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy had brought about. You have to also understand at this time, psychotherapy, when it was being practiced under psychoanalysis, was generally short-term, and often patients would come in for a period of treatment and then leave, come back, there would be relapses. There had been no consistent pattern, really, of treatment. And no data on the actual case. There were case descriptions, but no data on the actual, level of effectiveness of the treatment. And Reich was one of the first to begin to build that database. And he became really pretty much the leader of the more younger and what Freud referred to often derogatorily as the kindergarten, and Reich actually took that as a compliment. They were the ones who were really engaging and active and interested, rather than the old, we won't believe the last part of the old whatever he knows, the old know-it-alls. And Freud was actually very supportive for a while and then began to withdraw for a variety of reasons. Reich then became more and more interested in the physical anchoring of emotions and began to work increasingly and focus increasingly on the way people physically block and defend themselves, and began to identify this as what we refer to as the armor, or the way one armors or one protects oneself both physically as well as characterologically, as well as the way you behave, we behave. Okay? So, and for the first time, Reich began to build an actual set of diagnostic categories and descriptions of what people's specific physical, emotional, and psychological behavior constituted as specific categories that could be identified, and began to develop ways of working on these patterns and develop what initially was called what has become called resistance therapy, in the sense of going at the resistance, working on the resistance, hammering away at the resistance. This often led to a number of the more traditional therapists getting, and still to this day, getting very uncomfortable with that, because it was a very challenging and aggressive kind of work. Reich also then began to, and I'm not going to give the exact dates because that's gets scholarly. Anyone interested in that can make sure to be on our mailing list and come to one of the next events. Actually, probably in the spring, possibly the fall, depends on we can set up, we're going to have a very big event with a number of top psychoanalysts who are interested in Reich's work, and a number of orgonomists who will be doing a full day on the history and relationship between Reich's, basing on Reich's influence on psychoanalysis historically and to this day. But anyway, what began to happen with Reich was that he became increasingly interested in actively working on the patient in more direct ways, and began to actually violate one of the fundamental rules, which he began to work directly on the patient's bodies. He began to look at areas where the patient was holding or blocking, as we might say, and actually poke at it in some cases, sometimes work directly on it. This also required that he begin to have patients either partially or totally disrobed in order to see the body. And so again, this was also a no-no. He began to represent a group of therapists who were seen as more and more extreme, more and more radical in the context of the psychoanalytic movement. And for a variety of historical and political and personal reasons, it was a hotbed of interpersonal rivalries. He became more and more isolated as a faction within the psychoanalytic movement. And as a result of pressures both politically and socially, he eventually broke with the movement, or was pushed out, depending on whose version. His version is he broke with it. Their version is they got rid of him. The reality is it was probably both, sort of simultaneously. He escaped, since he was on the enemy's list of the Nazis. He escaped and wound up in Scandinavia and settled in Oslo, Norway, for an extended period of time, where he became increasingly separated from the psychoanalytic movement, and took many of the younger followers, not only in Norway but internationally, into and around him, and established an international group for sex political education, study of sexuality and health, and established a new clinical practice called vegetotherapy, which was to work directly on the body and to work directly on the relationship between breath, body, feeling, emotion, and organizing and reorganizing the armor, both behaviorally and physically. This group around him became extremely active, extremely visible, and was, like, from descriptions, the biggest show in town. And Oslo was a small town in many ways, and it still is from people who've been there. And he also became more controversial, since he became a very, very outspoken, and was and remained an outspoken advocate of youth, and wrote wrote a famous book on the sexual struggle for youth, and was very, very in favor. He was one of the founders and leaders of the international movement for sexual freedom, along with people like Margaret Sanger and Havelock Ellis and others. He was thrown out of that group because he was considered too radical. The most radical position two most radical positions that he held, interestingly, were a complete belief in the rights of children from infancy through adulthood to sexual exploration and sexual life. That doesn't mean sexual life with adults, but it means sexual life of their own. He also was clearly pro-women's rights, was one of the early advocates of the rights of abortion, not as a contraceptive device. He was very pro-contraception, but abortion as a woman's right and a doctor's, right to decide. He was also extremely militantly involved in decriminalizing of homosexuality, which in Europe at that time and even in England was a offense that could, and in the United States, an offense that could get you in jail, if not worse. So interestingly, so the League for Sexual Freedom eventually pushed him out as being too extreme and pushing too hard. He wound up establishing his own group, which was the International Society for Vegetotherapy, and then during this time began to become increasingly interested in scientific research into the nature of life and the function of life. And this led to his investigations and attempts to establish the physical existence of what Freud, many of you might know, called libido, or sexual energy, or psychosexual energy. And in his research, became the first person in history, really, to isolate what the Eastern religions referred to for many centuries as the chi, or prana. He basically isolated a life energy, or an elan vital, as some others had called it. But more than that, he not only isolated it, he visualized it. He was able to collect it and materially demonstrate its existence and show it visibly. In the process of doing this, he did increasing research on cellular structure and began to make incredibly amazing steps into the discovery of the origins of life, or what the movement between inorganic and organic life forms, between life forms and inorganic forms are, and began to publish extensively detailed scientific laboratory results on this, which of course got him in more trouble with not only the scientific community, but with the psychologists or psychoanalysts who wanted to have practices, not become laboratory scientists. It did get him a great deal of attention, to the extent where he was considered for membership in the French Academy of Science. He was there was talk about being nominated for the Nobel Prize. He became part of a very, very elite movement who were studying the natures and origins of life worldwide. A lot of that was lost during the Second World War, when many people were killed, destroyed, or reorganized. Reich became increasingly interested in the nature of this energy and how it played out in the body. So in this sense, just in preparation for where we're going, you can begin to see where Reich was moving closely and directly online towards issues of what we would today call body, mind, behavior, body, or energetic, or what he was the founder of the bioenergetic movement. He was the first person we know to use the term bioenergetic to describe this process. In doing so, he was specifically interested, and here's where, when we move over towards things like yoga and towards Greg Tebb's presentation or discussion, we will deal with this, and for many of you will have questions on this. For Reich, the goal became increasingly, how do you open the organism up? How do you liberate the organism? How do you free the organism to experience its most fundamental, basic root in nature? And for Reich, the basic root in nature is pulsation. All life, characteristically, whether it's a one-celled organism, and he was very interested, he did extensive studies of amoebas and other one-celled organisms, or whether it's a multicellular complex organism like a human being, pulsates. And natural living, all life pulsates. And pulsation is simply expansion and contraction. Expansion and contraction. And when organisms expand and contract on a cellular level naturally, that is effective function, and it involves an effective metabolism, metabolic process of energy. Energy is being literally, and now once Reich had established the existence of, interestingly, a number of practitioners of Eastern medicine have always agreed that Reich was, wonderful in having been the first to actually show materially the existence of the prana, the chi, even though they said it didn't really need to be shown. We all knew it was there anyways. And most Eastern practitioners will simply accept its existence without, having to physically demonstrate. Reich was a Western scientist, so he demonstrated it. His goal was to understand what is the most efficient economic way for energy to be freely metabolized. And in this case, we're now talking about a literal energy. So it's this, what he called, based on his research, orgone energy, which was a word that he essentially coined based on the nature of organic function and the function of the orgasm. One of his key works and one of his primary focuses before becoming more aggressively involved in the scientific study of the biological origins of life and nature was a work called The Function of the Orgasm, right? In which he studied the nature, the real fundamental nature of pulsation, which is expansion and contraction. Okay? And in these terms, it basically establishes the nature of the organism's ability to charge, build up a charge, an energetic charge, a literal energetic charge, reach a peak or acme, okay? A top charge, which, as we all know, has to be let go. It's like his favorite demonstration of this would be the use of a bladder, as we all know. Fills up, it doesn't get emptied. At some point, you either throw it out the window to break it, or it explodes, or it will do harm. Or if you let it out a little bit, it'll get a little more flexible, but it won't be that comfortable. As we all know, if we have full bladders and we pee a little bit, it's better for a while, but it's only a little while, okay? So Reich was very clear that this was also a process that was fundamental to the entire organism. And the organism built up charge, it needed to release this. One of the areas of greatest confusion in Reich's work is that everyone assumes that the only way to release energy, Reich felt, was to have sex. And Reich is very clear that the function of the orgasm is the most efficient way that genital sexual release in an organism that's capable of it has the most efficient mechanism for fuller emptying out of that bladder, in a sense, of that contained energetic buildup. But energy can be released in all sorts of ways, like talking, playing ball, reading, studying, doing all sorts of exercises, also surfing, other kinds of, and any of these exercises can be. That's a reference to a surfer that just came in. Any number of. Reich was a evidently top level skier, himself. So I mean, he was very physical. So these physical activities also release energy. The point in orgonomic practice is that the function of the orgasm is that it is the most, and we just have a hardest time getting this over to patients too. The function is not just to have sex, it's to have sex that allows for fullest release or effective release. And so, in one sense, one of the things, just quick, need a break?
No, I would just add in that this idea that this method is maybe more efficient, this method is less efficient, but never lose sight of the fact that it's the armor that prevents any kind of release or limits any kind of release.
So part of and that's right. So part of the nature of therapy or child rearing or education or exercise is to maximize the loosening of the restrictions in the organism against this natural pulsation. So the point is, once that gets into play, it leads to a very, very different approach towards how and what you're after, certainly clinically, or in any kind of even what we would call prophylactic way in terms of raising children, and building social structures. You're looking for, as David Silver said, ways of maximizing the flow of energy and the natural pulsation, but also ways of minimizing the buildup of bodily constrictions and behavioral constrictions that prevent that natural pulsation, that natural engagement in life. And so the therapies that Reich eventually, clinical practice that Reich eventually developed, which I practice and have been trained in, and worked with one of Reich's close associates, Victor Sobey, who's an MD, and clinician for many years in the United States. It's called orgone and that specifically involves a variety of techniques for getting the organism to pulsate as freely and openly as possible and to experience integration of the body from literally the head down through the bottom of the torso into the genitals, and to be able to establish a natural flow of energy and tolerate sensation, throughout the body, particularly into the below the diaphragm and into the genitals. One of the primary, and often one of the confusions is one of the primary techniques that we work with is breath and breathing. But this is not a technique. Actually, what we're trying to do and what our primary interest in is getting individuals to breathe naturally. And this becomes a big conflict, and here we begin to, I'm getting ready to turn it over to Greg Sucko. Our view of breathing is not a dogmatic position. It has to do with the natural observation of the way organisms breathe. Organisms breathe when they're not frightened or constricted, right? Essentially diaphragmatically. Diaphragmatic breathing involves the release of the diaphragm, the closing of the diaphragm, obviously, as the breath goes out, but the relaxing of the musculature around the diaphragm during exhale. So in many ways, it does not involve pulling up, it involves. So the most simplest demonstration would be, I'm in a high energy mode, anxious mode, so, but this is more appropriate kind of release. Very anti-yoga. Okay? We'll talk. But more specifically, without exaggerating it, right? The idea is to release the breath fully, extend the exhale fully, and the goal is to get rid of control, to lose control. That, of course, gets very controversial. What does that mean? Go wild, go crazy? No, it means basically not to have to basically organize oneself in order to engage and make decisions emotionally and behaviorally or interpersonally or physically that are not really coming from your, in another term that Reich introduced, which has become very popular these days, from your core. You're making decisions from who you are. So ideally, for instance, one of the biggest problems that men and women or couples have in general, the story is like seeing a couple come in, anyone who's done our kind of practice has had this happen. A couple comes in for 2 sessions that we've seen both. One comes in and says they're feeling really upset and stressed and tense because they had sex last night, but she didn't really, he says, I didn't really want to do it, but I knew he did, so we had sex, So I said, why didn't you say no? She said, well, I knew he was really going to be disappointed if I didn't, go through it. He comes in and he's stressed out and upset, and what's that? Well, we had sex last night, and I didn't really want to do it, but I knew she wanted to do it. So again, it becomes an irrational, you can see the predicament. It's an irrational, instead of being able to, but when you say to patients, when you look at yourself and you say, if I don't really, if I'm in the middle of a really hot, wonderful sexual encounter, and I suddenly lose it, and I don't feel like having sex, or I'm satisfied, and I don't want to go any further, can I say, hey, that's fine, let's stop for a while? Most people have a very hard time doing that because of social, emotional, and often neurotic expectations on both parties' parts. And so one of the things involved in this is really getting the organism not to get wild and have a lot of sex. It's to get to a point where sex becomes as natural a function as eating when you're hungry, going to the bathroom when you have to go to the bathroom, doing work when work is rational. And one of the problems is when work is rational. Reich also got into trouble because, and I've had numerous patients give up professions after they've gotten healthier because they decide, I really hate this. I had a woman patient who would have been here, but she was out of town, who was a top, CPA, certified public accountant in a major corporate firm. She got out early, which is better. She got out before this firm went under and became notorious. So that Yeah. She, as she got healthier, she just said, "This is killing me. I can't stand it." You know, and she had actually severe asthma, and the asthma began to improve as she got clearer that she had to get out. She got out, and lo and behold, she hasn't had an asthma attack for over 30 years. You know, she's had, doesn't mean she hasn't had respiratory problems, but it hasn't been asthma. Okay? So it's not miracle cures, but it's a different approach towards health. Obviously, and Greg will have more to say about this, and I think there's some others I'm sure will have things to say about this. The issue is many of my patients, what this sort of emerged out of is many of my patients and colleagues of mine who have patients in treatment have encountered people increasingly interested in yoga because yoga is very, very active, very available, very real, and very effective. But often, for patients who come in to me who are very involved with yoga, right, their experience is that I'm asking them to breathe, I'm asking them to relate to or respond to their bodies in ways that are contrary to often the practice they are being introduced to or have been involved with for years in yoga. And my goal is, and my simple reaction to that is, that's not really my concern. I have no desire that, as a matter of fact, I encourage patients to take classes with yoga teachers like Greg and Hildy and others. But I also say that you need to be able to breathe in a very open and free way. Now, my wife, who has done yoga for years, even before it was super popular, she did it. She would be furious with me. She did it in the early '60s out in San Francisco.
In like 10 or 5, right?
What?
10, 15, right, like that.
Yeah. So, but she has always taken the position very clearly that when she's told to breathe in ways that constrict her breathing or hold her breathing or control her breathing, she just doesn't do it. And if the teacher doesn't like it, she gets up and walks out and finds another teacher. And she's always done that, But again, so that would be the only fundamental issue for this kind of, for what Orgonomy is interested in relationship to yoga, is the question of how one integrates breathing processes in terms of opening the organism up and also controlling the conflict between the impulse in many yoga practice to control energy flow or to give the individual control over their experiences of their body, as opposed to Orgonomy, which is to get you to be basically as open as you possibly can, and there's limits to that for all of us, as open as you possibly can, as self-regulating as you possibly can, meaning as naturally connected to your own needs and functions when they come, without restricting it or controlling it, okay? And to the extent that anything facilitates that, it's wonderful. To the extent that anything, prevents you from doing that, then you have a problem. And I have no particular negative feelings. I've done some yoga over the years and I've been active in it, but I have no problem with people being involved in any kind of practice. I have people who do exercise routines, even weightlifting, which has its problems, maybe even more so, but as long as it's done in moderation and done in conjunction with a process of beginning to release and open the body, it's fine. Open the system, it's fine. Okay? To the extent that yoga leads to greater integration and greater physical mobility of the body, that's wonderful. To the degree that it encourages one to let go of mental, rumination and mental processing that pulls you away from, natural feeling and natural function, that's fine. When it gets into areas that involve, restricting or holding or controlling experience in the body physically and emotionally, then it's in conflict with what I do. Okay. So that's basically my little spiel. The basic idea would be then for Greg, take a short little transitional phase, and then for Greg to give a presentation, and then we'll probably finish up with some demonstrations, answers, questions, if you have them. And I'll take some questions now momentarily. And then for one brief moment, Dr. Bennett will give because he actually has actively been working in the Reich archives, which are up at Harvard, and has actually discovered, has discovered that there is a section that Reich actually wrote on yoga. Which, he had studied, I knew that he had studied all sorts of Eastern practices at various times, had been interested in it, but I didn't know specifically he had written on yoga. So if there are any questions before we transition.
I just wanted to say, I wanted to reinforce, I like the distinction you're making there. The question isn't, is yoga good or bad, is when does it enhance self-regulation, when does it detract from it? I think that applies to pretty much everything. And the other thing was, you basically said this, but just to pin it down more, is Reich was very focused on liberating the involuntary realm. And that's the piece that so many miss. And the control is the voluntary realm. And the whole question is, how do you harmonize the voluntary and involuntary realm?
And I think that's very interesting because obviously yoga and Eastern practices have long been, and Reich was very clear that he wasn't the first to talk about this kind of integration of mind, body, and behavior into a functioning whole. And he was aware that Eastern practices, both the Hindu practices as well as Chinese practices, were clearly approaching and trying to engage that issue and that concern. And the difference that we're dealing with is this question of self-regulation. So it's not just integration. It's not integration to achieve control. It's integration of the organism, of the body, mind, and behavior to achieve a state in which you trust your own organism to know what you need when you need it. So one of Reich's closest associates for most of their adult life was A.S. Neal, the founder of a famous school which most people don't know anymore, unless they've been involved. It's called Summerhill in England, which is still operating. Okay. Neal was the founder of what would be known today as free learning, and child-centered learning. And although he never used the word learning, he always talked about child rearing. He never called it a school. It was a child rearing community. But Neal was interested in helping children begin to learn and engage in life on what we call self-regulatory, self-governing basis, where you move based on, and so kids, this school that we're in, my daughter went here just as a change. We brought her here because it was based on some of those principles. The year that she came in, they changed the principles. This was her second grade classroom. So that's interesting. But at any rate, the point being that the real issue was that self-regulation involves the ability to do what your organism needs when it needs it, with awareness of the environment. It doesn't mean going over and saying, oh, I want that camera now, it's mine, because I need it, I want it. It means basically engaging in interpersonal relationships that are based on rational identification of your own both physical, emotional needs, and the self-governance has to do with negotiating that for mutual satisfaction. And conflict this is not about one of the worst things I think about most people who are into world peace is that they really think it's going to be peaceful. I mean, my original background was as an anthropologist. I worked with a number of people who were involved in the Bushman Project, at the end of the Bushman tribal groups, period. And everyone hears about Bush people in the Kalahari, and they think that these people lived in these kind of pacific, beautiful. Everyone was just back and forth and loving and friendly. And descriptions of Bush people's lives is that they were always quibbling and fighting and getting angry at each other, but it was mutually resolved. It wasn't. It was a process about feelings, emotions, needs at given times, and then working it through. So it wasn't like peaceful and blissful. It was very active, often very stormy. And interestingly, most often early in the morning after the fires are gone out, because you slept at night in the desert. If you've ever slept on the desert and woken up in the morning, you're very stiff, very irritable, and if you don't have coffee, You know, and that's when most fights broke out. But they were interpersonal. What?
No Dunkin' Donuts.
Yeah, well, they did have coffee, though. They were into coffee very well. That was one of the introductions from Westerners and from other groups. But anyway, so the idea is this process of self-regulation. And so Reich's concern particularly, I think, as Dr. Bennett will point out, you know, from what he was referencing, giving you a little preview of, was very much my concern, and what Tom DiFernando just pointed out, that if you there's nothing inherently wrong with opening and working and integrating and, you know, expanding the capability of the system, provided it serves releasing the natural pulsation, or opening the natural pulsation, or opening the organism to its natural pulsation more and more freely so it can regulate itself. Now, you know, that's the issue. Greg and I have had extended dialogues about whether and how this is possible, and he struggled very, very actively, as a number of my other students who have been, patients and students who have been involved with yoga have, to find ways of integrating that. Okay. So, do you want to just make a quick statement about Reich's comments on? This is Dr. Philip Bennett, who's one of the people who helps run our program when we have programs.
And I hope you don't mind.
No, please go.
I cleared it with him before.
People interested in Reich always have their favorite entrees to Reich, and for me it's always been the function of the orgasm, because it's the first book I read nearly 60 years ago, and also because it makes clear the importance of a liberatory sexuality at the heart of Reich's thinking. This book came out in English in 1942, and then there was a 1948 printing. Late in the 40s and into the early 50s, Reich revisited a lot of his manuscripts and tweaked them. And some of this revisiting got published. For example, People in Trouble, his book, which came out in 1953, is based on a manuscript he wrote in the mid-30s. And he excerpted parts of it and put out this book. He also prepared for publication, but never published, a book about the Trobriand Islanders, which is now in print, but it didn't appear in print during his life. But it was prepared in this period of the late 40s, early 50s. Starting in the 70s, new translations of Reich's work came out. And this is an example, the Carl-Wagner translation. The translations are not really good. The person who did them was hired by the publisher to translate. The earlier translations were worked at between Reich and an orgonomist, Theodore Wolff. So those translations were very careful, but nonetheless, the later translations have material that weren't in the earlier translations. And when Reich revisited this book, he added 3 pages, and he talked about yoga. And it was very interesting, and not many people were aware that Reich actually did talk about yoga, and it was clearly kind of an afterthought, and it's worth trying to understand historically why in the late 40s, early 50s, he felt moved to say something, but I think there is an answer. I think that's when yoga was first coming to the United States. I'm not a historian of yoga, I am a historian of Reich. And maybe you know, and I think there was a very popular Swami Muktananda, or someone like that. And I think
1880s and then 1940s, 30s.
Yeah, so it was coming into American consciousness, and maybe that's why he felt important to say something about yoga.
I can say that just quickly. He was also at that time, we know from his library, reading more on Eastern.
That's true.
And that was also a way. There was beginning to be a wave of interest coming in from the east, from the West Coast, of interest in Eastern philosophy. Watts had published, Zen, books on Zen and various kinds. So there had been a wave in the late 40s, early 50s, and probably also related to all these young people coming back from around the world during the war.
Could be that.
So Reich was definitely interested in this.
And you can see this if you go to the Reich Museum, his huge library. He has some specific shelves where it's all his religious books, because he was reading in preparation for the book, The Murder of Christ, where he consulted many religious texts, not just Christian religious texts. In any case, when it comes to talking about yoga, he places it in to the wider social context. For Reich, the main source of human malady is the patriarchal family, where you have the strong male leader, the repression of infantile and adolescent sexuality, the repression of women, and the notion that self-control is of paramount importance. Reich says, and again, this is written 70 years ago, but I think it was probably largely true. He said that this kind of repression was especially true in the cultures of India, China, and Japan. Now, it's a broad, sweeping generalization, but 70 years ago, I think that kind of traditional male-centered, male-dominated, controlling, self-control being a real ideal was a strong part of those cultures. You don't have to agree, you don't have to agree with me, and you certainly don't have to agree with Reich.
Isn't it part of this culture here?
Oh, of course. Oh, no, this is,
Yes.
you're absolutely right. He says, but what he says is he says this is especially true of the cultures of India, China, Japan. Now, I'm not going to argue this point. I just want you to know his perspective. His main concern was with the breathing technique that he understood to be associated with yoga. And he says the breathing technique taught by yogas is the exact opposite of the breathing technique we use to reactivate the vegetative emotional excitations in our patients. And Dr. Lewis talked about the kind of a free breathing versus a much more controlled breathing. I've been taking yoga classes for years, and I've had teachers who were always insisting that I tighten this muscle and tighten this muscle in here and do all this stuff where the breathing was very controlled as opposed to the kind of breathing done in therapy. What's also interesting is in this added 3 pages, and again, I'm not justifying this, I just want it on the table. He talks about the military attitude. And in the very same period, he talks about learning to pull in the stomach and put out the chest and put the hands at the side, probably reflecting on his own military training in the First World War when he was a soldier. But I thought it was worth just noting that, I'll just read the final, a passage, and I will slink away. And I'll never stop doing yoga. I'm going to be 70 years old, and I attribute part of my, quote, youthfulness to the fact that I do yoga.
And the monkey hormone.
And the monkey hormones and therapy.
Most of you are too young to know about monkey hormone.
And the carp and all that.
That was a therapy that was popular for a while
This is,
among the rich.
let me just read this passage, and then you're out. Thus,
It's time to get onto the yoga part, right?
Thus, we see a single thread stretching from the childhood practice of holding the breath in order not to have to masturbate, to the muscular blocks of our patients, to the stiff posturing of militarists, and to the destructive artificial techniques of self-control of entire cultural circles. I have to contend myself with this sketch. There can be no doubt that the importance of the attitude of the body for the structural reproduction of the social order. Let me read that part again, because this English is not good. There is no doubt the importance of the attitude of the body for the structural reproduction of the social order will one day be understood and practically mastered on a large scale. What he means is that by raising children with a certain physical posturing, self-control, hold the breath, blah, 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 this perpetuates the social conditions which give rise to the mass neuroses that we're dealing with. So I just wanted you to know that Reich indeed does talk about yoga. You won't find it in the Wolf translation, which the aficionados and the traditionalists like Dr. Lewis always consult. You have to look at the awkward Caravaggio translation to see this. Thank you.
Thank you.
For letting me do this.
So do you want to just move ahead, or do you want to take a quick break? Let people.
I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I would like to.
So, and then we expect you to all come back and sit very still.
And you're on the air.
All right. So welcome to the other half of the talk. I'm trying not to get my yoga heckles happening over here. My arm ring's trying to really kind of relax right now. I wanted to start with a really bad joke, but My wife says it's really bad, but I'll do it anyway. But there's an orgonomy and a yoga joke, and then there'll be another yoga joke.
Right, like bad jokes.
Yeah.
Dr. Sobey loved that.
And there's a lot of yoga people who I know, and my students and my friends here. So, why did the yogi cross the road?
To get to the other side.
To get to the other side, right?
Yeah.
Why did the ergonomist cross the road? No, to let go of the other side. See, that's a better one, right? Now, there's one more joke in yoga. And the yoga people get this better, maybe, but why do you do this deep sound breathing in yoga practice? Because we're taught yoga is about breathing, right? Deep sound breathing so that it stops the voices. You can't hear the voices in your own head.
So let go.
That's it, right? That's the extent of my
I think we have to put you into the dungeon.
So I'm going to start with a little background. My background in yoga. I started my first yoga class I went to when I was about 5 years old. I went with my mother. I remember this darkened room. I remember lots of ladies in fishnet tights. I remember someone telling me to loosen my belt, take my belt buckle off. And I remember the yoga teacher, this yoga teacher who had 3/4 of her lungs removed. She had 1/4 left. And she had a normal breathing capacity. She had created a normal amount of breath she could get into her body through the yoga practice. My mother and I did yoga for many, many years together. That's how we kind of came together. And she started when she was having a nervous breakdown. She went to a chiropractor, and there was a notice on the wall. It said, go do yoga. And the chiropractor said, the chiropractor was helping her through body facilitation. She was feeling better. So she went to yoga. And the yoga helped her feel better and actually got her through this crisis she was going through. So even from that, you can see there is some connection between the mind and the body through yoga practice. How I came to do orgonomy, well, my mother came to stay with me in New York. And she was like, she's coming, and we had an apartment in the East Village, and it was small. And I think we were trying to have a baby at the time, right? So you can imagine the juxtaposition. You say, oh, what are you doing, my mother? Anyway, so on the first day she arrives, right? It's 11 o'clock, I've taken her out for coffee or something, I come back, I'm in the bathroom. And I close the door and I'm on the phone to Kathy. She's like, it's 11 o'clock. What else do I do with her? She's here for 3 minutes. And I'm basically going, oh, I'm banging my head against the wall. I can't take it, I can't take it. And so I was like, and Kathy says, go see Dr. Lewis. Go see Dr. Lewis. So what do I want to see Dr. Lewis for? It'll give you some help. So I made an appointment. I called up Dr. Lewis, and so I went to see him, and the first thing is like, he sees me, he's like,
stop banging your head against the wall.
so I was like, the first thing is like, so why are you smiling? That's the way the economy people will get it. Why are you smiling? What's behind that smile? Because I'm having a bad experience, like, Dr. Lewis, how you doing? So anyway, so we had some sessions together, and I got some relief. You know, I was teaching yoga, and I've been a yoga practitioner for 25 years at this point, but I still couldn't handle my mother. So I got some relief, I felt better, and then I had some conflicts come up. You know, the breathing's not the same as yoga, you're getting me to lie, you're getting me to look, you're getting me to concentrate, you're getting me to breathe. It's not the same as yoga. You know, I'm going to have to stop this. So I stopped. I got the relief I needed, then I stopped. And I think that's a symptom for yoga too. Sometimes I see a lot of people come to me, and eventually the hard stuff starts coming, because what I do is difficult, really intense, deep, therapeutic, get into the body yoga. Different to what the yoga that I think most of you think what yoga is. And some people leave, some people go, some people stay, some people get deeper.
The point is that you were coming up with some hard stuff.
Yeah, so the point is, yes, as Kathy's pointing out, so this is Kathy, my wife. One of the reasons Kathy's here is that was a patient for Dr. Lewis for a long time, and she also done the Ashtanga yoga that I've done for a long time, and she was a student of Pattabhi Jois, the main guru teacher in India, because I've been to too, and I'm also training with his son. So she's really relevant to this discussion, because she knows where I'm coming from, she knows the Orgonomy side of things, and she knows the Ashtanga side of things, or the yoga side of things. Most of these people here in the front row are my students, my friends, and they do this practice of yoga called Ashtanga yoga. That's the one I'm involved with. So again, things were coming up and I stopped. So let's talk a little bit about yoga. What is yoga? So the most important thing about yoga, as I understand it and I practice it and I teach it, is that it's about breathing. There's nothing else. In Ashtanga yoga, the type that I do, the main thing that I tell people, the main thing that I tell them is breathe, breathe, breathe. My correction is not, move this here, but the main thing I'm doing is breathe. Breathe, breathe deeper, breathe longer. I'm not telling him how to breathe necessarily. The only instruction is breathe through your nose, which is different, of course, to Orgonomy, but breathe. It's the central core for yoga practice. So, what does yoga mean? This is the core root of what people understand yoga to be and to not be. Yoga is actually a noun. In Sanskrit, yoga is based around the Sanskrit language, a little bit of terminology. Yoga is a noun. It's a practice, it's a technique. The base root of the word is yug, means to yoke. So the base action that you're doing in yoga is not this position, this breathing technique, this concentration technique. It's actually this joining. And what are you joining? There's anything we can join with is this thing that's here, this body, this breath, or concentration. It's the only thing you can do. If you want to join with something, what do you do? It's not joining with the Starbucks or the cup of coffee that you see down the road. And that's a different type of yoga practice, maybe. But it's about joining with this thing here.
When you say the word union, you say join?
Yoke.
Yeah.
Union, yoke.
Union.
Union, yeah.
Union.
Yeah.
Yoke. To join with.
You know, a yoke, two cows?
Yeah,
Yoke.
I couldn't hear the word.
So everything that you understand as yoga is probably the technique of yoga. Right? Are there many techniques of yoga? There is the yoga that most people do, which is poses, breathing techniques, meditation techniques, chanting, lots and lots of forms. There's even forms of action called karma yoga. The karma yoga that people do is like, I'm doing my karma. That means you're doing selfless action. That means you have to, the teacher's telling you, you go and do that action, and you have no connection to the result. Right? You go and do, you're going to do the most hardest thing you could do, the action that's most difficult for you, but don't think about what's going to happen. That's karma yoga. Yeah? There's things called bhakti yoga, divine service. You're doing service for people. What you're doing is, your teacher will say, okay, help 100 people as many times as you can at the expense of yourself. Right? You're not involved. Right? So there's a joining, there's a joining of some sort involved in all of these things. She's just telling me where I need to go.
Reel them back in.
So Ashtanga yoga, this yoga that we practice, has a couple of sections. The first section is all about just physically making the body bend, getting into the muscles, stretching them out. It's not about holding anything, it's about getting a stretch. When you start getting deeper into your body, there's always some type of blockage comes up. Right? There's always some type of thing that starts to address. And this is the essential core of what this yoga that we do is about blockages. When the blockage starts to come, people get anxious. People get tight. They start to feel something building. They start to feel, Some people get more talkative. Some people come and they'll be like, I don't want to come to practice today. I think I'm going to skip today. I have to go do my thing over there. And so you'll see some people will get like this. Some people will start to move away, and some people just go for it. Depending on the personality, depending on where you're at, it starts to happen. What happens, from my experience, is that there'll be this build-up, this moving towards this blockage, and there'll be some type of muscle release, some type of shift in the physical body, some type of shift in the muscles. Like, for instance, there'll be like, I've had one like many openings in my body, many kind of like shifts. There'll be a shift in my, my thigh muscle. People will come up to me and say, I've got a lot of pain in my hip, I've got a lot of pain in my shoulder, my neck is really, really sore,
Talking
And-
about me. Sorry. What's that?
Blockages are like some sort of emotional. They're considered the same thing in yoga.
And so,
And in community,
so this pain will come up. And if people dig and they breathe and they dig and they dig and they keep coming to yoga practice, they keep coming to yoga practice, keep coming to yoga practice, then there'll be a shift, right? And what happens in the shift? There'll be a reaction. There'll be sometimes people laugh. People like, people get really happy. People start to cry. I've seen this happen many times in yoga class. Yeah, people get pissed off. People come up to me, it's like, it's, man, it's like that person down the road, my neighbor, next door neighbor, was like, I'm really, really annoyed at them. My father really, really annoyed at them. This stuff will come up. I'm getting the feedback from people all the time. In my own experience, I'll get to a point in my body, like, for instance, right now, I feel like my neck is really closed up. I feel like I would call it, I feel like there's a lot of armoring in my neck, and I don't want to talk. And then suddenly, I'll get back, and then I go blah 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 blah. It gets the blunt end of it.
but I think you have to put together the breathing blockages, breathing for the blockages, the release, and the repetition. How it is.
Yeah. So in India, in Mysore, was where the most intense part of this practice is practiced. It's a man called Tebb in India. And you'll get in front of him and you go through a set routine. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. There's no stopping the breath. This routine is set. Every day you do the same thing, you do the same thing, do the same thing. And people
I
get...
think it's no instruction on breathing.
Yeah, he doesn't tell you how to breathe, he just says breathe.
Just breathe.
Breathe, sound breathing,
Don't
breathe,
stop.
breathe,
Just
breathe, breathe.
Yeah.
And what happens is you get to a point where you get stuck. And then he'll say, okay, you stop. You stop there, you're stuck, you come back tomorrow. Right? And then you want to get to the end, because getting to the end is actually, you're the great yogi. If you've got this whole thing down, supposedly you're an enlightened being. Right? You've got to the point where you're really cool, you're a great yogi, and you can do these amazing things. You stick a leg on your head, you can back bend and grab your ankles, you can do all this great stuff. But what's happening is you get into this kind of like stuck point. Right? And your body won't move. Then some people will push and push and push and push, and suddenly the knee will get sore, the hip will get sore. But what's happening is this blockage is coming up. And again, what's happening is this emotional response will start to happen. People get pissed off, they get angry, they start to try, they want, I need it. And what they're actually trying to do is get this release.
Through breathing.
Through breathing, yes. So this release is it's coming from the body, but what happens internally from me, from what my wife feels, and a lot of these people here in front of you, you're feeling a shift in your head. You're feeling some type of release that's coming from your emotions, it's coming from your, maybe it's your character, maybe it's some part of your personality is being held.
I was just going to tell an anecdote. For me personally, I've done a lot of yoga like Greg, and also am a patient of Dr. Lewis and for years. And when I first started to do yoga, I practiced intensely, 6 days a week, an hour and a half a day. And the same thing happened every day, breathing, doing it, keeping going. And then you get to certain poses that are for whatever reason, I guess because of my armoring, more intense and more difficult for me. Now, people in the yoga industry, talk about, the blockages as being, muscle memory pain. You don't know what it is, but it's there. And I had a couple of really excellent experiences with that. Months and months I was working on a pose which is called Kapotasana, where you're kneeling on the floor, you're bending back over and you're grabbing your ankles. So it's pigeon pose. So you're actually, your head is basically, touching your spine, you're holding your ankles, and your whole chest, your whole stomach, your shoulders, your armpits, everything is exposed. It's totally open heart, totally terrifying for me. For months and months, every time I came to that pose, I would just start sobbing and crying, the whole big drama. Teacher just puts you in the pose, it's so excruciating, crying. Get back out of the pose, keep doing and finish it. Months and months and months. And because of the breathing and because of the sweating, there's intense sweating when you're doing this because because of the continued breath and the movement with the breath, you're sweating, you're dripping, your body's getting looser, and you get in a more meditative state. It's not so much about thinking, it's much more internal. It's not so much about where your arm is or your leg is. It's about, what's going on inside. And it's not the fact that I'm reaching back, grabbing my ankles in this specific way with my arms together and my arms out. It's the fact that my whole heart is exposed and open, and it's absolutely terrifying. So I kept, this kept going on and on and on, and it got to be a joke, and it got to be, the whole thing for months and months. And one day, I was really having a good practice. I had a lot of energy. I wasn't really thinking at all. I went, got in the pose, and I had, for an instant, this really clear memory of when I was a little girl. And I have 5 siblings, and we had a pool in the backyard, and my parents were in the pool alone. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. I'll get some time alone with them. So I slipped into the pool. I was really excited. And my mother and father held me underwater, kidding around like they were going to drown me. But there was actually a few moments in there where I really thought they were going to drown me. I completely lost my trust and my faith in them. I thought, they're really going to kill me now. This is it. and it was really clear, straightforward, and it came right back to me like, just like in the movies. And I, struggled, sobbing, swallowed water. They let me up. I ran, out of the house, ran down the street, and of course they, just made fun of me. But when it came back to me in the pose, it wasn't because I was looking for it. It wasn't because there's something blocking me. It just came, and it was boom, and it was right there. And then once I felt that, and I, dealt with it, and that's really pretty crappy. That's pretty horrible. I really got really good at the pose after that, and it wasn't an issue. And I've had the exact same experience working with Dr. Lewis through breathing, through, hitting things with baseball bats and, all the other stuff that we do. I've had the exact same experience, and it might not be when I'm in session with him that it comes back. It might be 2 hours later or 2 days later where somehow the same thing, something slips in your head and you get the memory of what
It's actually, in orgonomy, it's called spontaneous memory. What happens as the body begins to, become more integrated and open to itself, patients often experience, spontaneous memories. Things come. In traditional psychoanalysis, you work on that as a goal. In Reich's work, it was like those memories will come up and you'll work through them and come to terms with them. But what's more important is the integration of the organism. The memories are only past. It might be significant past, but ultimately, it's past.
But I think the point here that we're trying to make is that there is a similarity in the experiences that we have felt in yoga practice to what we felt in orgonomy. And I've had very similar experiences too. Like just the other day, I was in a session with Dr. Lewis, and we're doing this deep, heavy breathing, he's working on me, and memories come up, like I've been working for so long with this left arm trying to move this left shoulder for years and years and years. Why won't this left shoulder move? This right shoulder moves really, really super well. This one might move. And then through the work with Dr. Lewis, I understood and felt which muscle, which particular area of the body was not releasing. And then, I had a whole cathartic I want to talk about my experience because but I had a big memory comeback as well. And this is the type of thing that I'm trying to explain that is concurrent with my form of yoga practice and the stuff that we're doing with Dr. Lewis.
And when I was first trying to get Greg to do orgonomy, I kept saying to him over and over, the yoga kicks up the stuff and shuffles it around, and the orgonomy gives you a place to put it. It's almost like they work together for me anyway. I felt it was very, I don't understand the conflict, because to me, one helped the other. And it was they're both difficult and hard work and sweaty, but it was a very similar experience. So that's,
I guess I'm a little confused because you do Ashtanga yoga, right?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and I mean,
You should identify yourself.
Hildy.
Yes.
But I did a training with Ashtanga yoga, and I studied Ashtanga yoga for a while. And every different person that I trained with or studied with talked about the giant breathing and the locks. And I remember, I was thinking, and then I go to Dr. Lewis, and it's like, how can you relax when you're holding, in and up, and the different locks and
I understand where you're coming to. Let me clear up this point really
oh
quickly.
yeah, that's the thing you said before.
This is the point that people don't understand about yoga. Yoga was not invented from the outside. Yoga was invented from the inside. And what I mean by that is, the tradition is through meditative experience, through what's happening in an inward joining experience, certain reactions in the body are happening. And so, there's a thing in yoga called Mula Bandha. Mula Bandha is a tightening of the anus. And Uddiyana Bandha is a tightening or a working of the abdomen. Now, this happens because of meditative experience. It's not something that you do to create meditation. What I mean is that we are using this technique, which has been taught by an experienced yogi, that creates meditative experience. So we're using this technique to get back to the meditative experience. What really should be happening is you have the meditative experience and these things happen. And from my own experience, that actually does happen. When I'm meditating and my body is opening, my Mula Bandha contracts by itself. I don't do anything. My Uddiyana Bandha contracts by itself.
But I guess the thing that's different, therapy and breathing, you're trying to specifically release down there.
Push down.
Yes,
Down there.
but again,
But that's good,
it's a
that's good.
technique. Like this is a
Okay, so you're
technique.
just saying it's, there's orgone, breathing,
And there's
then
yoga
body,
techniques.
and
But what I'm trying to say is that, sorry, 1 second. What I'm trying to say is that we feel they have the same effect. It's not about the yoga technique. It's not about doing something. It's about the release you will feel after yoga. Most of what you'll feel as the benefit of yoga will happen after you've done your yoga practice.
But when you're teaching it, when you have students, are you teaching them to use the locks and,
Yes.
to do the giant breathing?
Yes, but Patavi Joyce and my teacher Manju Joyce, his son, I've been with him, they don't tell you to do Mula Bandha.
Yeah, that comes
They
after.
don't tell you to do
No, because all
the
the
deep
other,
breathing.
No, it's in all the books.
That's lack of
That's-
experience. They tell you to go and do. Yoga is about go and do the practice, and then you will see the results. There's a couple of techniques that are involved, and it's not about the technique, it's about this facilitation.
well, then
So-
someone should be telling these teachers, because I always found it very stressful doing
Right, having all
yoga.
these things going
Because
on.
I was,
That's why there are so many yoga teachers out there. So many yoga teachers. And yoga teachers, now you go and take a yoga course, and you become a teacher in half an hour, 15 minutes. The people that Patavi Joyce and Manju give their blessings to are the people who have gone through this whole practice and have experienced, or they feel that they've experienced a lot of these things. And they teach the yoga from their experience with this outside technique.
Let me just add a couple of things here, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
What, in terms of an orgonomic perspective, we had talked about possibly making some comments back and forth. So, first off, I think in terms of orgonomy, Wright was famous for saying he didn't care what you did as long as it opened up the system. So he would tell Dr. Sobey, who's my teacher and colleague, that if a patient came in and you hit them on the head with a hammer and it opened them up, not only would they come back and ask you to hit them again, you know, you would use that technique. But the techniques are not as, the main point, and Reich is very clear about that, and actually people who study Reich often come to Reich's books and expect they often get frustrated because he doesn't really tell you how to do it. He tells you the basic principles. He doesn't say, try this, try that. Right? There was an orgonomist who wrote a book that told you exactly how to do it, like step by step. And Dr. Sobey encouraged me to follow those steps, and I did. And I came back and I was angry at him and said, well, this really works. How come you didn't tell me to do this? And then a week later, I was trying step by step, and it didn't work. And I had a real crisis with a patient, and he came back and said, that's why I didn't tell you to follow it step by step. So I think that's consistent with what you're saying, for one. For two, from an ergonomic perspective, it's quite simple, and here's where some of the issue is. I don't really, I mean, if the technique works, and by the way, in terms of most of the patients I've had who've done yoga and do yoga, it helps them open up, that's fine. I have no, it's only when it comes into conflict with the specific work that we're doing that it becomes an issue. But specific to this, you're talking about tightening. Reich makes it very clear, and he's not talking about yoga, he's talking about the specifics of how you deal with you know, with the organisms. And he says very specifically, you know, where's the, he said very specifically, but I lost it.
Where is it? It was right here. Hey, we're on the wrong.
That's the picture again?
No, this is the right page. The stomach and then the anus, the tightening of the throat and the anus are blocked.
If the throat and the anus are blocked, the orgastic contraction becomes impossible. In other words, normal release of the orgastic contraction doesn't mean just having sex and having orgasm. It means the natural release of the body become impossible. Now, one of the things anatomically that most people, almost every patient will experience this in treatment, or some people experience it when they're not in treatment, is the relationship between the mouth and the anus, and not just because of eating, when it obviously has something to do with that. But when you begin to really pulsate freely and openly, the body tends to move mouth towards anus, the anus and the mouth begin to move towards each other, almost like a worm.
Forward.
What?
Forward.
Well, actually, it's more of a, you know, circular move, and it's a release, and it's a pulsation that's quite natural. So when, in terms of the work we're doing, what we want to do is is exactly contrary to that. Now, by the way, and it's interesting, there are techniques that we use which encourage the patient to tighten for periods of time, you know, voluntarily, in order to trigger release. I mean, and basically one of the things that goes on in orgonomy continuously is that you're working on areas that are blocked. Sometimes you have to even encourage and build and get the patient to be able to tolerate a more intense, you know, intense blocking before the actual release. So that's not inconsistent. The issue is whether, as Hildy is bringing up, whether there is a tendency to organize, as some teachers would, and I wouldn't work with teachers who were, you know, proposing that in any practice, of consciously learning how to tighten and control and prevent sensation.
Can I say something?
Yes.
That specific thing that we're talking about, Mula Bandha, Uddiyana Bandha, and Ujjayi breathing, you know, in yoga, you know, it's only about the breath. It's really an internal practice. You could have no arms or legs and still be doing it. And these are descriptions that they give to people to use them to facilitate breathing. And I think that these are very advanced things. I think they're taught on a very basic, low level in yoga classes. And I actually think, you know, and Greg and I have talked about this, that you know, like, if you're doing yoga, if you're doing yoga for a couple of years and you're really doing your practice every day and you're working at it, Mula Bandha is going to come naturally because it's an energetic thing. You know, you're not tightening your stomach, you're activating it. So when you breathe, it comes into here, you know, and it's not a blockage. It's a long, you know, the breath is a long rope, and so you're making it skinnier because the longer you stretch out the breath and the slower you're breathing, the longer you live. You have, 300 breaths in your whole life and you stretch them out, that's just a theory. But so it's not so much about tightening and cutting off, it's about, strength, it's about lengthening it and making it comfortable and being efficient in your breath, because you don't need to breathe really heavily all the time. Sometimes you can breathe really in a deep way, but a string of a breath. And so I think it's more about a finessing of breathing. And I think, and I know a lot of people teach it this way, that first you have to lock here, then you have to do this, then you have to do this, and then you start doing sun salutes. And I think that's a lot of the misconception that is happening. And it's easy to get caught up in the specifics of it. And I think the thing about Ashtanga, and probably Greg and I's personalities, is that we're both more physical, so we just start, I've never breathed right. I never used Mula Bandha. I can't even hold my stomach in. I mean, I just didn't practice, But, I don't have the strength, and I can't do the lifts that other people can do, but I always kept breathing. And so it facilitated a certain other thing. Maybe if I was, I don't think if I was locking up it would have stopped, because I think it works when it's working. But I think if you're just focusing on those really specific things, it is going to shut you down.
No, I think what I'm trying to say is that the yoga is not about the technique. It's not about the holding of the pose. That's just a way of stretching out this muscle, stretching out this muscle, stretching out this system, stretching out. When you're doing a yoga pose, which is really intense, and the deeper you go into yoga, the more intense the poses get. You can't hold your muscles. You've got to let go. There's nothing that you get so raw. You get to a point where your body is so exposed and so raw that you've got to let go. Right? Yes, Michelle.
I just had a question, because when you teach yoga, you seem to have an intuitive sense of where the students' blockages are. And we used to talk about this in the ladies' room after we were practicing. Greg would not be in the ladies' room. The girls would be in the ladies' room. We always do it before work, so we would do our practice, and then after we would all practice in silence, we'd be getting dressed for work, and we'd be talking about whatever happened that day in practice. And one of the comments was always that Greg, what made him a very unique yoga teacher, is that he sort of seemed to have this intuitive sense of what was blocked. And so I always wondered, with you, if you could see those in people, like for instance, why so-and-so, could move a hip, and we often wondered, like, when you walk into the room, do you as a yoga, I think it's a gift, I think it's a very intuitive thing.
I understand.
And are you helping the person move through it? Because when you place the hand
That's
and you
what it's
present
for.
Ashtanga in an extremely gentle, soft, and accessible way, which is very unique, but do you sense that as a teacher, and I would say the same to Dr. Lewis, when you're speaking with someone even verbally in practice, are you recognizing where their blockages is? It is your role to help them get to the blockages and through it?
Yeah.
Or
Okay, let me answer that.
Yeah.
I think because my system of yoga is set, I don't have to think about it. All I have to do is teach the person the routine and bring the person through the routine, right? And teach the specific techniques that are relevant. I don't try and change anything. I take on faith that my system really, really works. And that faith comes from my experience and from the people I talk to. It just keeps reinforcing this experience that this is great, a good thing to do. It gives great relief to the system. People seem to feel happier. And, what else is there? And that happiness produces, I think, a better functionality. I don't go with the person down to Starbucks and talk too much about it. But within the room, I see that functionality. Now, to answer your question, from my consistent work with someone, I work with people over time. I just don't see this person. I see someone for years at a time, and I start to notice where's tight, where's soft, and I think I have an instinctive just look. I can look at a body and say, well, this area is just uneducated. This area is working. This area is overworking. And my job, I feel, is balancing out. It's not to force this area, it's just to balance out, to try and get a little bit of relaxation here, relaxation here, and then to let the person, because I feel that these yoga poses that we do are intelligent. I feel that they will draw you in naturally. And I think, that's where I'm coming from in that point of view.
I mean, I don't mean to be fast, but
Go ahead.
just because in almost any kind of training I've done, they always talk about breathing through the nose.
Yeah.
Now, in orgotherapy, you don't breathe through the nose. And I understand what you're saying. I guess you teach it differently than most yoga teachers, because
Yes.
almost any
Okay,
kind
sorry.
of.
No, he teaches breathe through the nose.
Yeah, no, okay, so I understand this, right? When you're moving your body a lot, I think it's impossible to do mouth breathing. You know,
I disagree.
I disagree.
No, I
Okay.
disagree too.
no, from the particular point of view that we're doing, I think it's impossible to do this particular. And also, I think because the mouth breathing, from my experience, produces a really quick emotional experience. It gets me in really, really super quick. If we had people doing mouth breathing in the middle of a yoga class, I think it would be inappropriate for the people coming in. They won't be able to handle it. So I think the technique was developed through the nose. This is just one point. Let me finish.
Okay.
Okay, I've got a couple of points going here. And I think it would be too much of a psychological workout for people, right? I think this type of thing is appropriate on a one-on-one session with a therapist and a psychologist or whatever. Secondly, the breath that we're doing in this particular practice is meant for a specific effect. That specific effect is to heat the body up, okay? Right? You heat the body up so that your muscles become hot, your body becomes hot. Just becoming a heated system starts to open the synovial joints. The joints in the body just start to naturally want to move. When you get hot, the muscles start to melt. And our teachers talk about this system of breathing that we do, this yoga system we're doing, is the body starts to kind of melt. The body starts to open up. It's like in a yoga analogy, it's like a lotus flower. You're the center of it, and then all the muscles start to open out, right? And you're open. You don't have to do that much work. It just naturally does the work.
Let me just step in here and say, from an ergonomic perspective, what I did, from my perspective, again, I don't care as a practitioner of ergonomy whether a patient is going and doing this work. What I'm concerned about is in contrast to what you're in terms of what you're asking, I'm looking very specifically at where and how, and I work directly on the body when necessary in terms of resolving places where there are blocks and helping to establish as much integration in the organism as possible. And varies according to the individual on a lot of levels. I'm not going to get into that right now. But I don't have a problem, and I have, as I said, many patients who have either teaching yoga or been in yoga, practicing. The only time it becomes an issue for me is when the kind of breathing that we're talking about, and by the way, a lot of people come in and have problems breathing who don't do yoga, so it's not specific, it's not a conflict with yoga. I have many patients, these two who identify themselves here, who come in and basically when they work have no problem, releasing the breath, or have no more problem than anyone else has, including myself. So we get the work done. It's when individuals have very specific, patterns of breathing that are problematic and sometimes, enhanced by or exaggerated through yoga practice, that it becomes a problem. And then for me, it's not about the yoga practice, it's about how I'm going to get them,
Well, that was,
to release.
that was really, in the end, that was what I was thinking, that I think if you breathe well, then doing special breathing for yoga or different kinds of breaths, that's, fine. But I think a lot of people don't even breathe. So to ask them to restrict even more, to restrict the throat and do the ujjayi, when they're just like chest breathing anyway, they walk around like this, and that's just from my own experience.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But
Everyone has their own
if you're-
experiences. But what I'm saying is, this is a specific technique that we do in yoga called ujjayi breathing.
Yeah.
The Sanskrit says, the really technical says, you breathe in through your nose, You breathe down the back of your throat, you breathe into your chest. You breathe out the same way. That's the specific technique that we do. Now, in yoga, and I've found in my in yoga philosophy and in my actual practice, the right side of the body, if you breathe on the right side of the body, it heats it. If you breathe on the left side of the body, it heats it. If you breathe in the mouth, it cools. So the left side of the body cools you down, the right side of the body heats you up, and the mouth actually tends to cool you down a little bit. It cools. We're trying specifically in our practice to heat the body, create this really heated environment. And the only way that the teachers came up with this particular technique to do this particular practice and heat the body in such an intense way, I'm talking, you'll see steam coming off people. You know, you'll see people in this room, when you go into an Ashtanga yoga room, my sort of practice room, that's bouncing, everyone's breathing. And you'll see sweat pouring off people, you'll see steam coming out of people's heads, you know, and this is not unusual. In the summer, it's like, you know, and it produces this heated environment, the body just melts. And that melting creates this like, and Dr. Lewis pointed out to me, when I'm doing a little bit of study with him, it's like this feeling of release. And I have so many people come up to me and they go, I just feel so much better. I've let all this crap that was sitting on my system. I just feel better, you know, and then I feel lighter. I feel healthy. I feel like I'm going to bound out of the room and I want to get into life. Right? That's one reaction, of course. But it's a general reaction. Yes, do you have a question? Yes.
Yeah, well, I practice a bit of yoga, and just a reaction to what you're saying and what I've heard other people say, I can understand how someone can kind of get into a thing about this idea of the blocks and holding the breath, especially when they ask you to hold the breath. But the thing I think about it is that it's very conscious. It's something that you're specifically engaged with, but you don't leave the studio and continue to
Right, you don't do it all the time.
hold your breath, you know, do opposite with nasal breathing. Like those are, as you said, to create heat. Like there's an actual ending here. There's a function for that. And I think maybe that's what people get confused about. That when you leave that environment, it's like that's when you have that
It's like
sign that you described, because you create all this movement inside your body as a result. I mean, because the idea of the locks anyway is to lift the energy up, right? So that you have the energy more at your disposal.
Like I was saying before, the locks, the only purpose is that they function when you meditate. When you're deeply in meditation state, and I feel like I've been to these meditation point, these things automatically happen on me. I'm not doing anything, they just happen. My spine straightens, the base of my anus tightens, my stomach goes up, and it feels amazing, it feels great. You know, do I hold that? No, I have to come back to life and get into it. So I think it's a technique. It's a technique, and you let go of the technique as you step out the door, and it has the effect.
I have one quick other question.
Yes.
So, Ashtanga specifically versus, say, other practices, like, say, Jivamukti practice, or more just vinyasa, where it's a hodgepodge, it's not an ordered practice. So, what is the distinct difference in benefit between Ashtanga versus a practice like that, which is maybe more varied?
Repetition.
Well, it's the tradition in Ashtanga Yoga is that you practice a lot. You practice 6 days a week. It's not come and do a class and come and do a class.
Right.
It's a set system. The first aspect of the system is called Yoga Chikitsa, which means healing. Disease healing or body healing. So it's supposed to have the effect of curing any ailments within your body and allowing the body to sit in a very natural state. The second part is called Nadi Shodhana, which means river cleaning. It's referring specifically to the spine and the nervous system. You know, and that particular sequence is a lot of stretching of the spine, twisting it. There is, like, for instance, putting your leg behind your head. So, you know, you're working the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. You're working this connection between the brain and the body. And so what the spine is purely just as a connector between this part and this part. You know,
But
what's in here and what's out here.
To get back to her thing,
Yes.
the thing about Ashtanga is that you learn you learn it yourself, it's your practice. No one's talking out loud, you're practicing on your own. You do the same thing every day, and you becomes muscle memory, you remember it. And it's a really well thought out, practice that's much older than orgonomy, that was designed to, bring health to the body. And it does. And you detox and you get the blockages and you work through them and you get to it. And you can only get that if you go to a different class every day. It's fun, I like to go to Bikram sometimes and stuff like that. And if you do the same thing in that, like Bikram is similar with the same poses. If you do the same thing and you work at it, it will work on your body. And it's easier for your body. It works better because you're getting all the same spots, and this is a system that really cleans the whole body up.
It's meant to detox. It's meant to physically detox you.
So it's just more effective in actually doing what, if you want yoga to do that. Some people just want it for relaxation.
And it's meant to get the crap out of your head. It's meant to detox your head as well.
Get less injured because this practice is very specific. Because I feel like, I've been in yoga a long time, but not this practice. And I've had a lot of injuries over the years, like shoulders, elbows. From yoga? Yeah. And so, like, I would stop.
What kind of injuries?
Well, yeah. Are they injuries or just pain?
Stretching the tendons out?
Yeah, whatever, you don't want to know my problems.
No, but right on, yeah.
Okay,
right on.
I deal a lot with this. I deal a lot with people's injuries. It's one thing I'm really good at. And a lot of people say, they'll come to me and say, my knee gets better, my hip gets better. And there's one very specific way I go about it. I look at the person and I start looking at the strains and the stretches and the balances within the physical system, right? I'm not tackling their heads too much. I'm just looking purely at the body. But then I'll see, okay, this knee is sore, and I'll trace it back, and I'll see, well, this muscle is getting connected to the hip. All right, now you work the hip. You work the hip, and suddenly it's like, I don't want to work my hip. And it's like, I think I'm going to leave today. I'm having trouble. So what I'm seeing is these, most of the time, it's not all the time, most of the time, these injuries that people are having is the inability for the mind to address the area of the body. I can only see that as this mind-body connection. That's my only way I can look at it. Yes, Laura.
So following up on the mind-body connection, is there a map that you have, like, if you're holding something in your hip, does it mean you're having one kind of emotional blockage versus your chest having some kind of heart?
I think it's too cerebral. I think you can't think of it that way. I think you have to look at it as Dr. Lewis, I think, looks at it, in my opinion, for our discussions. It's a totality. There's no here or here or here. You have to look at it as a...
Keeping with the question, I think it is interesting in that from an ergonomic perspective, there are places where people hold, specifically, that we can pretty much predict certain types of both emotional and physical illness. So for instance, people who tend to have severe abdominal holding to begin with, usually at certain stages in therapy we can expect them to begin to develop somatic symptoms related to abdominal, somatic abdominal problems. And usually what happens is spontaneously, I remember, I always had that problem when I was a kid, and such and such. So in that sense, that's a little bit, different in terms of the kind of specific clinical practice that we're doing.
Okay.
I want to make a testimonial, because Greg did some, I have from multiple injuries over the years from my misspent youth, as they would say, in my rotator cuffs in both shoulders. And he was doing just giving me some movements and stretches, and I must say he was extremely sensitive to the limitation of my body and very quick and very agile in adjusting. I was very impressed with how agile he was in adjusting to what my limitations were in terms of my movement. Rather, I think a lot of injuries happen, and I see both in all areas of practice, whether it's yoga or in treatment. And Reich is very clear about pointing out that therapists often make the mistake of pushing patients, and I would think coaches or practitioners, of pushing individuals beyond what they're. It's always important to push a little bit more, just so you gain some, you get some gain. but the impulse is to become overly aggressive and lose touch with the individual and push someone to a point where, that doesn't just hurt a little bit, you actually,
And there are
cause an
many,
injury.
many yoga teachers out there who do the same thing. They push and because they have no understanding of this releasing element. This idea of armoring, and I must say, from the work I've done with Dr. Lewis, it's made me a much, much better yoga teacher. And for the reason is, I can start now to feel more of this armoring and this aspect that is integrated and theorized in this, but is practically in the system. And whether you do orgonomy or yoga, it's still there. You're still going for it. So what I'm doing all the time is just trying to soften, find this, and I was like, relax, 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 breathe, 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 relax, relax. Okay, can I say one more thing for you? Dr. Lewis talked about the diaphragm and the stomach, right? This whole breathing. He talked about the anus, the genital, and the throat. These are integral areas in yoga practice too. Yoga practice, and what is designed in my system of yoga, is you work firstly on the stomach. And you work and you work and you work. And there's a squeezing, there's a moving, there's a softening of the system. There's actually a softening and the ability to bend it. Like most people can't bend like that, right? In a cold position. I couldn't, right? So there's a release and there's a relaxation that should happen in the abdominals. In yoga practice, we may tighten, but the actual release, the actual practice should be releasing. And then that's the first area. Most people are comfortable with this area. They'll comfortably get into it. And then we go from Mulabandha or the anus and the genital area. This is Uriyana Mulabandha, or you can say the anus and the genitals, right? This area is the most difficult, I find, plus the neck, for people to access, right? So what we're doing in yoga practice is making the stomach loose, profoundly open and energetic, and then we're pushing people, we're actively asking people to stretch muscles right down to the tip of the anus, right down through the lower stomach. And I'm asking people all the time, stretch your throat, relax your throat, bend your neck. And you're saying it's like the mouth and the anus coming together. There are yoga poses that literally pull your anus and your mouth close together. This is a metaphor for what you're talking about. Pulling.
No, it's not a metaphor. It's a literal function. You should also know that in orgonomy, when Reich identifies in one of the difficulties, the difficulty of opening up into the pelvis and genitals and an anus is very, very clear why most people are constricted in that way. But what we call the thoracic region, particularly the carotid area, the fear muscles. So it's an animal reaction. When you're afraid, you tighten up.
Right.
So, and that's directly related. What you see in patients constantly, or individuals constantly, or children. Let's stay away from the clinical. When a child begins to get very, very agitated, begins to feel very worried about their anal or genital activity, the first thing they do is begin to tighten, and because it becomes an area of fear. I mean, you can do demonstration. And if I went over and grabbed the carotid, you would experience, any of us would experience severe fear reaction. It's natural. Dogs know it. It's an animal reaction. So all of these things really are. I mean, and I think Greg's little jibe about how this predates orgonomy. It's true. It was actually you, but she. The reality is, Reich always was very clear about saying none of the things that he was discovering, including the orgone, were things that were undiscovered before him. He was just particularly organizing it and seeing it in a particularly more Western scientific clinical manner. And the point here is that the goal, in this kind of presentation, I have complete, comfort in that if it gets people open. I think what happens is many people go into yoga, in my experience, and find a kind of practice that allows them to enhance their tightening and holding, and they feel very comfortable with it. It's more comfortable that way.
It happens in yoga too.
Right. Well, I'm saying they go into yoga for specifically to get that kind, and that yoga practices that, or any of these any of these practices that encourage opening and release often, push, many people away unless you do it carefully and slowly to the point where the individual can tolerate more and more expansion.
And that is consistent, sorry, I'll let you know. That's consistent with the way our teachers, W. Joyce, Mother Joyce, and the real intelligent teachers of this system, they're like, gradually. And W. Joyce, his English was not, say, gradually you take, gradually. His English wasn't very good. But it's like, yes, slowly. And if I push someone too hard, I'll nod really, really quickly. They'll stop coming. They'll tell me, no, please don't push me that hard. And I give people the right to come up to me and say, please. I'm always talking to people, how are you feeling? What's happening? And a lot of people will test me, please let me know if I'm pushing you too hard. Because I think I have to be safe, and I have to be safe for their systems, and safe for them to be able to handle this particular.
The rule is first do no harm.
Yeah. So you have to.
Standard rule.
First thing is health, and then cathartic release. Okay. So any questions? Yes.
Yeah, there's a comment in relation to the other Michelle that you were saying. And you're asking the question about focusing on blocks, and that Greg seemed to be a little more intuitive, more unconscious about it. Dr. was more conscious and systematic. That in orgonomy there's a concept of contact, which basically accounts for
What, contact?
of contact, emotional contact. But the less chronic armor you have, the cleaner you are inside, you just spontaneously sense where the blocks are in other people. Where he's just doing it a little more intuitively, and he's doing it as a conscious technique. But you can't do it, or you can only do it to the point that you're dealing with your own chronic learning.
Oh, yeah.
That'll be a blind spot to you
Yeah.
in this person, whereas this you'll be able to help
Exactly.
here.
There's
Yeah.
a tradition
Good point.
in our particular yoga practice. Tradition is you can't take someone where you haven't been. You can't teach someone a pose which you don't know yourself. It's dangerous because you don't know what happens in your system, and so you can't address the system of someone else to see what is going to happen. Okay. Yes.
And a couple thoughts over a period of time. I don't know which one to go with, but on that topic, I was thinking of an analogy of chronic armoring or blocks. If you could think of it as someone wearing dark glasses all the time, so they're not aware that they're wearing dark glasses all the time. And perhaps one way to show them what it means to wear dark glasses is to put even darker glasses on them for a period of time when they take them off. So maybe some of these exercises and techniques and restrictions are just a way to make, sort of bring the individual
Build up the tension.
into awareness that there are such things as restrictions and what it feels like. You have to be more restricted to feel what it
Exactly.
feels like to let go.
There is a type of stretching called PNF stretching, proprio neuromuscular facilitation. I think that's the term. Anyway, this particular stretching means that you have to create tension to release tension. Create tension to release tension. And this is inherently built into this particular yoga practice I do. First we stretch and then we relax. First we stretch and then we relax. It's in every stretch we're doing. There's a tensioning, then there's a relaxing, and then there's a coming back to a tensioning again and relaxing. Yes.
Well, the other thought I had earlier was just, it seems that in both systems there's this enlightened individual who's, moves freely. There's the person who's achieved natural pulsation. But in each case, it's not that there's a complete absence of contraction at that point.
No.
It's just that there's an ability to expand and contract naturally according to a natural, and when there is a chronic blockage, chronic expansion or contraction in any place, that's like wearing the dark glasses. And both systems are trying to find a way to get from point A to point B, which is not easy to do, and therefore there are many different techniques and ways of getting there that more or less might be attempting to achieve the same things. And if applied mechanically, without contact, each system will be a failure and could harm.
I like you a lot.
But applied with sensitivity,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I see what you're getting to. Yes, any other question? Yes, your hand up first, okay, in a second.
No, I was,
talking about the breathing, I definitely agree, because I have tried to do yoga practice with open mouth breathing, and especially if it's a vigorous practice, it boosts stamina. You know, you really do need to build up that internal heat. And it's like building up, you know, charge to be discharged after the practice. So,
Yes.
you know, definitely I've experienced that.
Yes. I think everyone's going to be different, but I think yes. From my experience of the orgonomic breathing, and when Dr. Lewis gets me to do it the way he wants me to do it, I feel a big release. You know, when I do my yoga practice, and with the same breathing, and you know, I get to a big charge, I also feel a big release. Sometimes different, sometimes the same.
You have a question?
Yes, I have a few things to say. Ujjayi breathing, I mean, how do you do open mouth breathing? I don't even understand that, but I don't think I've been breathing correctly because, you know, I don't really breathe that much through the nose, so I don't think I've been breathing that correctly. That's one thing I have to say. The other thing is about character analysis.
Charged, very, very focused. It's called appetitive behavior. It means it becomes seeking behavior, and it becomes focused in, and all the physical, it has nothing to do with consciousness. We're not dealing with a kind of cognitive processing. The body, all the random, discrete behaviors get organized into seeking the breast and begin to root, which is a basic biological thing. When that organism, if the mother is available and open, reaches the breast, it gets on and there is this intense focus between mother, child, and the two bodies merge, and that's what Wright called the embrace, the superimposition. They merge intensely, often for just moments. It's not necessarily very intense. And you will see the infant begin to go through various levels of slow, release from that intense charge. And when the baby is done, that is probably the most perfect description of what a natural release, orgasmic release, and Wright called that early on an oral orgasm, which people have argued about. So orgasm is not about fucking,
In a second grade class of your daughter.
Is that on right now?
It's not about the erotic nature of sexuality, the pornographized nature of sexuality that we all live with. It's about literally the organism being able to, in some way, access that simple, or what Dr. Sobey was always very fond of saying, we have programs like this, we have discussions like this, to talk about with so-called experts things that every deer in the woods, every animal in nature knows just by its natural, biological roots in nature. That's how much, the sadness is that's how much we've lost. One of the things that's always struck me about how far back yoga goes is that these are things that people have been trying to access, and figure out, for centuries. My years of working and interest with Kung Bush people was that they really had no problems with it. I mean, they didn't know Reich or anything like that. They just basically lived, this kind of, natural impulse, and they had no problem with children being interested in sexual behavior and being aware. And also sexuality tended to be not very private or secretive. And just one last little quick anecdote. When these associates of mine brought on one of their last trips to the Kalahari to work with the different bands, brought back, on my suggestion, copies of Playboy to see what reaction the natives would have. They thought it was very popular. They thought because it was the funniest thing they had ever seen. First of all, it proved that Westerners were totally crazy, because why would you have a magazine that had pictures of naked women? What interest could that possibly be? And not only that, the biggest question they had, they could not understand how anyone could nurse on breasts that were shown in these magazines. They didn't look like real breasts. They didn't look functional. They didn't look like, what a breast should be. And so they just thought it was the silliest, and they passed it around, but not for the reasons that we would pass it around usually in this society for curing an injury. They just thought it was totally hilarious that anybody. So again, it's about this issue of natural function. And again, the issue is whether yoga, and if for me, based on everything that Greg and Kathy have been presenting, people have been talking about, has never been a problem, in the way that, I think the way that Reich was looking at it was the kind of presentation of yoga originally as a very much more rigid, as I remember as a kid, it was like you go in and you do, it was much more an exercise routine than a way of opening it. And I don't think it was very Eastern at the time it was really introduced into the States.
Let me say something about the people that I've taught. I have a habit of asking people what they do in their yoga practice. I mean, what do they do in their lives when they come to yoga? And so I've had a lot of actors come to me. I've had a lot of dancers. Right now I have a lot of people who are like in management, who are lawyers, who are doctors, who do that type of thing. Going back maybe 10 years ago, I was teaching a lot of actors, a lot of dancers. And what I noticed was that the ability to bend their body for an actor would just come much more naturally. The ability for a dancer to bend their body came more naturally. And why an actor and why a dancer? I mean, I know the actors had some movement training, but they didn't have the type of movement training I went through. I was a professional dancer, and I was made to bend, stretch, be able to create a picture with my body, at any given time they want. So the only way I could think about it was they're more comfortable being another person, portraying an emotional experience, portraying being more vulnerable in their own self. And they were much more comfortable bending. And I thought that was really quite profound. Because, okay, there's another body and mind connection. And
You could do some demonstration. We can go.
Not wearing the right shoes.
yeah, are there any more questions?
I just want to respond to the woman in the back about why Ashtanga, and that is that I think the practice is very comprehensive and it's well structured, so that if you do the whole practice, you really cover like every aspect of your body and movement, and that if you focus on the whole practice, you're going to meet your areas where you're resistant, and if you don't skip those asanas, then you get to work through kind of all aspects of your psyche. So that's why I like the Ashtanga practice. It also has like a beginning, middle, and end, so it like heats you up and it cools you down, and it just makes sense, And also about breathing and Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha, I think of them more as like focal points for my mind. So it's not like I'm engaging everything and I'm tensing it. It's more like I'm focusing on it. So you'll find that you're on the mat and all of a sudden you're thinking about your day and you're thinking about, oh my God, I had that meeting or I had that stressful event coming up. And then I'll go, oh wait, I'm not thinking of my breath and I'm not thinking of like these energy centers in my body. And I think it's a relationship you have with yourself. And whenever I realize that, I'm totally in the moment. And then I enjoy. I'm feeling the practice. I'm not like somewhere else. So, and I asked Greg once, because I noticed somebody next to me was doing all this nose breathing, like, and I said, why don't you tell him to breathe in his chest? And he said, because, people need to come to it. Like when you walk in the room, you hear the Ujjayi breathing. You know that's what you're supposed to do. But even for myself, I find often I'm like, oh my God, I'm not doing my Ujjayi breathing. And what's great about the Ujjayi breathing too is it's like your lungs are like bellows, and if you really start doing it, it kind of does it naturally. It kind of, you inhale and then you've got to exhale and then you've got to inhale again, and it has a life of its own. You don't really have to control it, and it feels very good to do, and it helps all the muscles in your back that are interrelated kind of get activated.
So do you want to become a student, a Ashtanga student now?
Well, I've always been intimidated by Ashtanga.
Okay.
It's a more hardcore practice.
Yeah.
Simply, and
Yes, it
like I
is.
say, I have these weird injuries, tendonitis, I stubbed my shoulder, I have a tight shoulder, I have a tight hip
Tight,
Come on, I'll
tight
fix
things,
it.
that's right, tight things, yeah, he's an expert.
On 49th Street. Let me say one thing about the pulsation. Dr. Lewis is talking about the pulsation.
Yes.
This natural pulse of the body. Dr. Lewis had a patient of his who was an Ashtanga yoga practitioner. And he was having questions, having all these things coming up of yoga and orgonomy. So we did this private session together. And I got him to breathe. Breathe and breathe and breathe. And we did about half an hour. We went through, about half an hour yoga practice. And I got him to relax. And I got him to really, really super relax. Because once you've really, really worked your muscles hard, right, that's one thing, then you can relax, you can let go. And so he's relaxing, he's relaxing, he's relaxing, he's relaxing. And at the end of it, I asked him, I could say, what was your experience? And he's saying, I had very similar issues come up as I would have with Dr. Lewis. So this is this idea of movement, pulse. I think the breath, this Ujjayi breath, as you were saying, creates a pulse within the system. It's like a meter. And you're using this metered breath for like an hour and a half. You're going and moving and going and moving. And from my own experience, I'll lie down and I'll start concentrating on my breath. And then I know the breath is only encapsulated in this part, but I'll start feeling it pulsating. If I just let my mind go, I'll feel this pulse going in and out, and it starts to widen and it starts to get. But the areas I can't access with this pulse and I can't feel in this pulse are these tight areas that I'm working on in my yoga practice. So it's like some kind of correlation in that point. Yes?
I want to say something about pulsation also from, at least in my own study of Orgonomy. Although Wright saw pulsation everywhere, the pulsation he's mostly talking about in the body is emotions. The capacity for the expansion and pleasure and the contraction and fear, and being available to that, which also speaks to, I would concur with actors, they're more available autonomically. So that's a lot of the flexibility that people lack is due to a tightness in the autonomic nervous system, an inability to pulsate. The pulsations you're talking about, he would still acknowledge, but that's not.
No, actually, the pulsations he's talking about are close to, I have to correct it. Reich, specifically in the later work, is really talking about the biophysical pulsation, which have emotional correlatives and are directly connected to the expression. Emotion in Reich's terms, in orgonomic terms, is the external expression or the emoting, the pushing out of internal physiological bioenergetic experience from a cellular level through the organism. It's not specific to, the early work starts with, as I try to lay out, with an interest in patients' inabilities to express emotion or to access emotion. But actually, I'm impressed with how similar the goals are in that respect of opening the organism to natural pulsation, to natural experience from a cellular level on out. How you do it and what you do and how you get to it might be an area for further exploration or discussion. But the goal in orgonomic terms is to get that natural, organismic pulsation and get the individual to tolerate it. And the problem is a young baby, if it's not interfered with, tolerates it quite well. We learn over lifetime how to tolerate the interference with that. And that has its expression in blocked emotion. That's where we mostly encounter it.
I was just thinking that, I don't know if organic therapy is, deals with children, but,
but mostly we deal with their parents.
The parents, okay, right. Correct the parents.
A.S. Neal and Reich, A.S. Neal said it quite simply,
Yeah.
he had never encountered a problem child that didn't have a problem parent.
Right.
I also
I
do,
agree with that
I'm
100%.
a professor at the New School, and I teach specifically, I specialize in, my work is particularly on the work of John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, and Daniel Stern. I teach an extended course in child development based on their work, and that is very specifically related to the origins of developmental impasse and developmental impact on children. So the answer is, we do work with children, but usually to support them in learning how to handle their parents.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's somewhat not related, but I was just wondering if how each of these would approach like dietary things, which may or may not, maybe it's not an issue.
You don't want to ask me about dietary things after, I was the one who bought this.
If in your different systems, if that has any impact on the ability for the body to pulsate naturally.
I think certainly food is
right.
probably one of the
Yeah.
crucial issues that impacts on overall bodily function on all sorts of levels, and we know more and more about that. I'm a bad example of someone
Okay, Greg will talk about
to
that.
offer.
My yoga teacher quote says said food is poison. That's a direct quote from my
Oh,
yoga
that's
teacher.
amazing.
Food is
Dr.
poison.
Silvio used to say that.
Really?
And so,
Wow.
so the point is you're introducing
Yeah.
something into your system
Yeah.
which your energy has to deal with, right? So, I feel, when I eat, I feel like my energy just drops out the floor. I feel
Yeah.
really, really tired,
That's
And-
physiologically what happens. That's why most animals, when they eat, sleep.
Yeah. And so,
Right.
so this idea that food is a poison, that your body has to deal with that. Has to deal with that. And then there's a tradition in yoga that the energy that you're using for your food, you redirect that energy, and I believe it's kind of the Orgonomy, that energy, and it's literally, I feel it. It starts to get pumped into the rest of the system, I'll feel more energized at 12 o'clock in midday when I've done yoga, I've done teaching, and I haven't had any food, and my system is tightened up, and I feel, kind of astringent. I feel kind of everything pulling together, and my energy starts to build and starts, and then I'll go and have my snack and the bus, and I'll fall asleep. And so I think that's the idea of energy use. Food is poison.
Yeah, I'll offer the
We
counter.
need some of that, we need some of that poison.
No, I think that there's a repressive thing behind that personally. That first you have to make a distinction between food that's consistent with our physiology and food that's not consistent. That's one thing. The second thing is, and I've had this experience, and I've studied holistic nutrition and I've practiced it, with eating. The rare times where I had what, mechanically speaking, was the perfect meal, where everything just went together perfectly. After I finished eating, there was no heaviness, there was no fatigue. I was ready to go out and play football. So
Holistic nutrition.
Well, it's just whole foods.
Whole foods, yeah.
Whole fresh foods.
Yeah.
Whole
Yeah.
fresh
Yeah.
foods. I can give you more specifics later, but basically, what
Yeah,
comes out of the ground.
Right, of course, yes.
But you eat it in a way that
Yeah.
it doesn't stress you. Just because something, wait a minute, just because something requires energy shouldn't be draining. I mean, I think that's the whole sexual thing with the Tantra thing. They say, oh, you want to conserve your energy, you don't want to release an orgasm. There's something nourishing. It's the difference between, enhancing pulsation through eating or through sex, or looking at it mechanically and draining something.
Well, we know, I mean, there's no question about it that certain foods are more detrimental and more, more damaging to the organism than others and create different responses. It is interesting, in nature, all primates, eat and sleep. So if you watch the grazing habits of mountain gorillas or the grazing habits of chimps or bonobos, bonobos, of course, eat, sleep, and eat, have sex, and sleep.
Right.
What? No movie. No movie.
No cigarette?
No, but in nature, the normal pattern is grazing, eating, very extended, small amounts of food at a time, and then sleeping and resting. And so the issue is, I think the issue is the difference, the emphasis is there's a difference between feeling heavy and going out and feeling a natural, after eating, a natural, slowing down and relaxing, and keying down, biologically to digest and process. I think is a key distinction. That eating to a point of being satiated and heavy is obviously a pathological response, which our society emphasizes extensively, for all of us. I mean, so not to do that becomes really a struggle. And one of the things that these people I worked on who worked with the Kung did a book that they thought were going to make a fortune. It's a great book, but it never went. Called The Paleolithic Diet. And basically it has to do with, remember, you have to keep in mind that primates and humans, particularly human primates, are essentially key to, we're carnivores, but we're omnivores rather, in the sense that we eat both meat and vegetables and grains. But in fact, in nature, you're lucky if you get 20% of your diet over a week period from meat, because it's just unreliable soil. So you eat mostly grains and berries, and in the Kalahari, you eat the mangango nut, which is the most perfect food ever invented.
Okay, and in conclusion, I want to say one thing. I practice yoga in a very traditional manner. I have a guru. I have a teacher who I think is Mickey Mouse. I think he's amazing. I think he's like, I'll go to be with him, and then, I don't feel anything. I don't feel stress. Sometimes because I'm having a vacation. but my point here is that he's taking my yoga practice away. He's not giving me more yoga practice. He's taking the stuff that I had and throwing it out the door. He's like, okay, now that you're really good at these poses, okay, you stop doing them. You stop doing these hard ones, you just don't concentrate on these ones. We just need these ones to keep you healthy. And then what he's doing is pushing me, And then Dr. Lewis has been doing the same thing. He's like, you need to get out there, you need to do workshops, hence I'm doing a workshop. And so that's what my yoga teacher says, he's go and do a workshop, go talk to people. You need to get your voice out there. So he's making me write a book. He said, you write a book for me. So I'm writing a book for him, right? And we're going to put this book out. He made me go on his video. So he's putting me in the most uncomfortable position I can be. And making me function in areas that I have great difficulty. So,
he was a dancer, so he had no problem being physical.
Dancing.
But to talk publicly is hard.
So that's what I mean by, as a yoga master, someone who is really can understand the individual and then can understand the practice and see how they merge together.
Since I guess we're not going to have any demonstrations.
I'll do some poses if you're going to see.
But I guess people would like, I assume people would like to see some. But a couple of things, just quickly. When you leave, if you want to be on our email list, there's a sign up so you'll get announcements for things that we're doing. And if anyone did not pay, pay myself or Greg on the way out, but otherwise, the last is yours.
All right. I'll do the sun salutation, which is the beginning of a yoga practice, and you'll see how the breathing works. That's the basis of every yoga pose. This is some basis of that is in the yoga pose. So it's always a moving and active. The point is to get hot, and I can feel the heat coming out of it. Yeah. So every pose is coordinated with that, or some aspect of it. So those are yoga poses that we do. So you can sweat as to sweat.
Now we have to carry you out of here.
No, he'll float.
So breathing exercises in yoga. So with J1 I was just doing. You right, mouth breathing exercises. The breathing exercise is called Bastirika, which is called the bellows. Push people away. Some flame might come out. We'll see. Thank you. In yoga, we're always taught there's a point of concentration. So we look here, traditionally look here. There's a point of concentration, a gazing point at the navel. That pose we were talking about, bringing the navel and head together. This is one that goes like this. this is the one I like to do. My yoga teacher, he says after breathing, what you're supposed to do is just actually not do anything. The idea is to relax, let go of any tension, let the energy go from here that you've been holding and let it move to the outside of the body. So that's about relaxing. So this will soften and my shoulder will soften. The only thing is straight spine and everything else drop off.
Thank you.
Basically, don't worry, I'm not gonna.
You can say
The main thing is that, again, I'm not, again, the practice is the practice. Clearly, what's interesting to me is that it is really, and it does enhance and encourage, obviously, opening the system, so that's fine. I'm still not personally convinced that you can't do it with an open mouth.
Disagree on that.
I can make an observation on that because I'm in the open mouth world too. When you close, I think part of the function in this, not only generating heat, but you're enhancing a stretch. Because you decrease, you expand with your mouth open, so if you're doing the stretch with your mouth closed, you're going to enhance the stretch, which may be part of the function of what you're doing.
Yeah, there's many things I don't know about.
You're also directing inward, any energy inward, which is where you're getting heat.
I'm just wondering if a marathon runs with an open.
That's a good point.
They tend to.
No, I think it's closed when you're running.
No, usually you
I can't
exhale.
break it.
My yoga teacher developed a way of using this breathing for running too.
When I ran, I was always told to breathe mouth.
Well, let me add, there's the other thing is from the point of view of
But the mouth is
if you're thinking in terms of retaining breath or retaining oxygen, that's one thing, but if you're focused on engaging pulsation, then as long as the breath is moving, it doesn't have to be deep or a little bit. You're going to have energy available because you're drawing from the pulsation, you're not drawing from the oxygen.
I would think you would run with the mouth
It's hard. It's really hard. Yeah.
Okay, so again, again, if you want to be on the mailing list, put your name on the email list. There's some flyers about Orgonomy if you're interested, or just stay in touch with Greg, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Hope we gained
Very
something.
interesting, very interesting. So you're